We're talking about this as the summer of Paul George. So let's focus in a little bit more on Paul George and the Paul George sweepstakes here, because the 9-time All-Star has until Friday to decide if he's going to opt in or opt out to test the unrestricted free agent market. The PG averaged 23 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists in 74 games last season for the Clippers. And the 34-year-old has only hit free agency once throughout his entire career. So we're now going to welcome in our Clippers reporter, Om Young-Masuk. So Om, hopefully we're getting him in here in just a couple of minutes. We're having a couple of issues communicating with our audio department now, so I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about this. Oh, here he is there. Om, thank you so much for joining us here on NBA Today. Where do talks currently stand between the Clippers and Paul George as the clock keeps ticking down toward the opt-in deadline?
Malika, I thought it was quite telling that at last time that reporters talked to Lawrence Frank at the end of the Clippers postseason run, Lawrence Frank referred to Paul George and James Harden as they're going to be free agents, which told me that it was very likely the team was not going to be able to come to an extension agreement with Paul George. Now, as you know, Malika, Paul George is one of the nicest guys in the NBA. But let me tell you something. After they came to an agreement, the team with Kawhi Leonard on that 3-year, $150 million extension, Paul George said he was very optimistic that he, too, would be joining Kawhi and getting an extension done. But as talks began to pretty much, I think, break down and disintegrate because Paul George was not getting what he wanted to hear or what he wanted, you started to see Paul George become more irritable every time he was asked about his contract status. And before the playoffs started, he was asked, where do they stand? He would not even answer the question. Let me tell you this, though, Malika. One thing Paul George has to factor in, and I do think he really loves this about playing in Los Angeles, is that he's close to his family. His parents come to every game. His mom is in a wheelchair, but she's able to see him courtside. He's not going to get that if he goes somewhere else. That is something that he really has to factor in. And one other thing, Malika, all with the domino of Paul George, one guy who's waiting to see what happens is James Harden, because he wants to see if Paul George remains, how many years Paul George gets, because he wants to align himself along with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George.
Well, if the Clippers and George don't come to an agreement, we know that there will be plenty of suitors, right, Malika? And I may or may not have witnessed the start of it based off of what we've seen, especially, Malika, when you think about the situation with Paul George. And so when I am looking at this outcome, clearly it's going to be fascinating because, again, I said before, he is an X factor. He is someone who has options. And I do think the patience has worked in some ways because now I know that they were lining up when you were the Clippers, the opportunity to make this come to fruition. But the fact that he's been patient, I think this will serve him because if you think about the Clippers lineup, he probably was one of the most consistent out there overall. And he was someone that really just his game is very complimentary. So not only is he attractive to the city that he's currently in, he's also very attractive to every other destination. So to me, that is a major win-win overall. And I think, you know, now that we're thinking about the Clippers side of things and Paul George, should we think about another side?
Right. And so we need to think about who potentially could be interested, could be suitors here for Paul George. So I want to bring in our reporter, Tim Bontemps, into the conversation, who covers all things Philadelphia. Tim, do you believe that the Sixers are positioned to go all in on Paul George?
Well, Malika, the Sixers have been positioned to go all in on this free agency cycle going back to last summer when they did not extend Tyrese Maxey, who they believe in, and they're going to give a max contract this summer in order to have as much salary cap space as possible. And Ohm just talked about James Harden. When the Sixers traded James Harden last fall, ultimately to the LA Clippers, they did so getting back draft picks and expiring contracts because they wanted to make sure they would have max salary cap space this summer to go after whoever they can get on the market. And obviously, as you guys have laid out, Paul George is quite clearly the #1 player available this summer. And if you could pair him on the wing with Tyrese Maxey at the point, with Joel Embiid at center, you'd have a guard, a wing, and a big. It's exactly what you're looking for in the league. It'd be a definitional big three to have. Daryl Morey, the president of basketball operations for the Sixers, has long been someone, as we all know, that has chased stars in every way possible. And certainly, the Sixers are as well positioned as anybody to strike and get Paul George in free agency, assuming he does opt out of his contract and get to free agency on June 30th.
Interesting, because, you know, we all saw when Joel Embiid joined our NBA countdown set during the NBA Finals. Paul George was also on the set, that little side eye that he gave. So I don't know if that's where things maybe started there. But, Tim, another team that has been in the East that was kind of knocking on the door, the one who sent the Sixers home packing, the New York Knicks. New York has plenty of trade chips to sort of push in if they want to. How aggressive can they be in going after a guy like Paul George?
Well, this is the other side of things, Malika, because we just talked about if Paul George opts out, right, that he could go to the Sixers as a free agent. They have max cap space. They could just sign him. If Paul George opts into his contract this week, like James Harden did last June, then all of a sudden, I think you start to look at trade scenarios, and that's where the New York Knicks come in. The Knicks, as you laid out, have a ton of draft capital that they can trade. They've got a bunch of movable contracts that they could trade. And the Knicks have been waiting for years now to strike on a big-time player in trade to bring to New York. Now, after making it to the second round of back-to-back years for the first time in almost a quarter century, they've got Jalen Brunson, they've got Tom Thibodeau, they have this team that is really on the ascendancy in the Eastern Conference. It's obviously the talk of New York City. And if you drop a star player, say Paul George, say somebody else that comes available, onto this team, you might be talking about a team that could really go toe-to-toe with Boston atop the East. We'll see what the Knicks do over the next couple of weeks here and what they ultimately decide. But this is a team that could have traded for Donovan Mitchell a couple of years ago and didn't want to overpay because they wanted to make sure they were ready to get the right guy down the road. We'll see if that happens over the next few weeks.
Tim, thank you so very much for that information. Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, there are plenty of ways that the Paul George extravaganza can play out. I want to bring in Tim Legler into the conversation because Tim is the team that gives Paul George the best chance at winning a championship. Is it the Clippers or is it somewhere else?
Yeah, look, I think it is probably Philadelphia because you're talking about maybe the most dominant offensive individual scoring force in the league in Joel Embiid, another legitimate star in Tyrese Maxey who's about to get his max deal himself. Paul George certainly represents a major upgrade for the Philadelphia 76ers at that spot now that Tobias Harris is finally off the books. But here's the thing, if you're Paul George, you've got to ask yourself a couple of questions in that situation. One, are you going to be left carrying an unfair burden at the end of the season if Joel Embiid is once again hobbled in the playoffs? And if that's the case, you now become a guy that's looked at as the savior to bail them out if you get to the postseason in a very difficult town to do that in. There's an immense amount of pressure when you play in the playoffs in Philadelphia. Media scrutiny, fan scrutiny, you name it. That city is desperate for an NBA title, and so many different things have gone wrong for them in the Joel Embiid era. Once they get to the postseason, Paul George would be the guy that everyone would look at as getting them through that hurdle, closing the gap with the Boston Celtics. And with Joel Embiid's health history, you don't know what that's going to look like at the end of the year. And then how does that experience play out for Paul George? I think there's a lot of things to consider there for him.
I do have to wonder, Shanae, being teammates with James Harden, who was on the Philadelphia 76ers, if he has said anything to PG about what his experience was like there, if that swayed one way or another.
To me, I think it's more about what PG brings to the table. And I'm looking at these three teams, the Clippers, the Knicks, and the Sixers, and I look at it as a puzzle. And he is a piece that can fit probably best, per se, when it comes to Philly, in my opinion. They need someone else that can carry a load, that is excellent off ball. His skill set is very different than Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. You feel like that three dynamic all over the court would bring something that they have been waiting for versus the Knicks. Do you really need another off-ball creator when you have a heavy ball-dominant guy in Jalen Brunson?
Right.
And then you've just seen, like, we picked the Clippers at the start of the year.
Yeah.
And it feels like, you know, we were let down in some ways. Sometimes that repeat gets old, and so I do see Philly as a place that maybe it's a fresh start, he can be his best self, and he can win.
And I think what's concerning if you're the Los Angeles Clippers is you look at Paul George and Kawhi Leonard, and they played the most games they have played in a Clippers uniform. They were healthy for most of the season. They were able to be out there, and still, when it came down to it, Kawhi Leonard, he missed several games in the first round, and they ultimately were sent home by Luka Doncic in that first round. That's not what they want. But they're also looking at opening this huge, big, expensive arena coming up here, and they want stars and a good team where fans are going to want to come out and see that. So they have a decision to make, too, on how much they want.
He's sitting cozy on his couch right now, though.
Exactly.
Here, Paul George this, Paul George that. Free agency is set to begin soon. We got the draft in a couple days, but the main fish is Paul George as of right now, right? You have James Harden, you have DeMar DeRozan, De'Aaron Fox not opting into his extension, not signing it, and yeah, a lot of big pieces here and there. Klay Thompson might be on the move to Orlando. We don't know 100%. Jimmy Butler, what is Miami going to do with him? All these in a future video. But the main deal here is, the main piece is Paul George. Now, the Clippers, they could have signed him to an extension like they did with Kawhi Leonard. And, you know, you think that Clippers would have done that by now. You think they would have actually signed him by now? Because you signed a guy by the name of Kawhi Leonard who always injury prone. And you signed him to a massive long-term extension, not long-term, but an extension. And Paul George, he's much more, you know, available to the Clippers organization, and you don't sign him, right? So that has to say something. Clippers don't believe that Paul George is worth that money, because if they did, they would have signed him by now. They didn't. So now you have people knocking at his door. You got the Knicks, we'll talk about in a second, the Warriors, we'll talk about in a second, and the Sixers. The main three pieces, those guys. A fourth runner-up would be Orlando Magic, because they got the space, they got the room. They could just flat out sign him to a big lucrative deal. Now, Warriors. Let's talk about the Warriors. Warriors, they want to make a big splash, right? Rumor has it they are contacting everybody. KD, Lauri Markkanen, Jimmy Butler, and of course Paul George. Sign and trade is most likely the case. I don't know if they're going to do that with the Clippers organization, because they're in the same field, right? Or same conference. So, you know, the most likely here is if Paul George opts into his contract, that means a trade is coming. So will he opt in to the Clippers organization and force a deal out there to be, you know, existed? So my thing is this: if you're wanting to maximize your potential to win a championship, right? Why would you opt in and get a trade done and get all those pieces, the main assets for that future organization coming back to the organization that you just left? So in this case, if Paul George wanted to trade to the Warriors, right? He opts in, and the Warriors send, I don't know, Kuminga, Moses, Moody, a couple other pieces, Klay Thompson's contract, or if he opts in, I don't know. You know, do you send that to the Clippers organization? I don't know, right? I don't get that piece. If I want to win, I want to actually maximize those chances, right? Like, let's talk about the Sixers organization. Sixers, they have Tobias Harris. Now, Tobias Harris is on the rumor that if Paul George opts in and requests a trade to the Sixers organization, Sixers would send Tobias Harris back. Now, that kind of boggles my mind because, you know, Tobias Harris is a good player, but he's nowhere near Paul George, right? Then you got to send pieces back to the Clippers organization. They have the room to do so, but what boggles my mind is how this rumor is legit, because people talk, right? James Harden, who hates Daryl Morey, must have obviously said something about Daryl Morey to Paul George. And Paul George is on the record saying, players talk. So does he really want to trade to the Sixers? Is that going to happen? I highly doubt it. Let's talk about the New York Knicks. New York Knicks is the best fit, I think, for the Paul George sweepstakes, because Paul George is a dynamic two-way player. I know he's obviously aged here and there kind of thing, but he can still, make stuff happen. And if you go to the Knicks, who do the Knicks send back in return, right? Because Paul George, he wants his money. He wants to get paid. And if the Knicks actually grab Paul George without a sign and trade, and they just flat out sign him, they're obviously going to be over the cap. And will James Dolan actually cough up the money for that? If it's a straight up signing, I doubt it, right? Because they got so many CBA restrictions now. It's incredible. You want to sign OG Anunoby to a deal as well. So, there's a lot of pieces out there. OG Anunoby is the missing piece. Obviously, what you saw in the Knicks playoff run, he was very vital. Unfortunately, he got injured with his hamstring. We also, what happened with that. But OG Anunoby, I would prioritize as one of the features for the Knicks. If you want the Paul George thing to get done, you also do Paul George as well. You got the money, you got the draft assets. So maybe if you want, send, picks here and there. I have a feeling that Julius Randle could be on the move. Julius Randle could be on the move to the LA Clippers. We don't know. There's a lot of stuff in play, but the teams that can outright sign Paul George without sending any of their draft capital back or any of their pieces, you have the San Antonio Spurs, the Utah Jazz, and I don't know, I think it's like the Washington Wizards or something. All those, and Orlando Magic, all those teams Paul George does not want to be a part of. If he wants the money, go there. If you want the money, go to those 4 places. But if you want to win, you go to a contender. And the most talked about contenders right now, as of right now, are Paul George, the Warriors, the Knicks, the Sixers, possibly the Orlando Magic, because they did play well in the first round of the series. Again, I think it was against the Cavs. They did fairly well. Imagine with them with Paul George, and actually imagine them with Klay Thompson as well. If they can get those 2 pieces done, that'd be incredible. But at the end of the day, these are just rumors, and expect more Paul George news to come out in the next 48 hours. This is very, very a hot rumor. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know. People are saying that he could return to the Clippers, but if he was going to become a Clipper, it would have happened by now. So leave a comment in the comment section. Tell me what you guys think. Where will Paul George end up in free agency? Leave a comment in the comment section. As always, Jag from Jaggy Sports.